In February 1959, 9 experienced hikers entered the Ural Mountains. Their goal was to cross a remote mountain pass few people had ever visited. Days later, all 9 of them were dead. When rescuers found their tent, they discovered it had been cut open from the inside. The hikers had fled into the freezing night, barefoot in temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius. Some died near the forest. Others collapsed while trying to return to the tent. 4 of them were not discovered until months later beneath deep snow. Their ribs were crushed, their skulls fractured. One woman was missing her tongue. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints except their own. The official report concluded only one thing: they died because of an overwhelming force they could not overcome. This is the story of the mystery at Dyatlov Pass. In January 1959, winter in the Soviet Union was at its most brutal. In the northern Ural Mountains, temperatures often dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Blizzards swept across the frozen landscape, and vast stretches of the region were completely uninhabited. Yet for a group of young hikers, this harsh wilderness represented the ultimate challenge. They were students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Most of them were in their early 20s, but they were already experienced in winter expeditions. At the time, winter hiking was a popular sport in the Soviet Union. Expeditions were classified by difficulty, and the route they planned to complete was considered a Category 3 trek, the highest level of difficulty. Their leader was a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. Friends described Dyatlov as calm, methodical, and inventive. He enjoyed building and modifying equipment, and he had personally designed parts of the group's hiking gear. For months, he had been preparing the expedition. Originally, the team consisted of 10 members. Their destination was a remote mountain in the northern Urals, Mount Oteton. The mountain's name came from the language of the local Mansi people. Roughly translated, it meant, "Don't go there." But for the young hikers, the name sounded more like an invitation. On the 23rd of January 1959, the group began their journey. They first traveled by train across the industrial cities of the Ural region, then continued by truck toward a remote settlement. Eventually they reached the small northern town of Ivdel. From that point on, there were no roads. The expedition would continue entirely on skis. In their journals, the hikers described the excitement of the trip. Some wrote about laughter during the train ride. Others recorded songs they sang together. They also took many photographs. Those photographs would later become the final visual record of the team while they were alive. On the 27th of January, the expedition officially entered the mountains. Snowfields stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The wind grew stronger, and the cold intensified. A few days later, the team encountered their first setback. One member developed severe sciatic pain and could no longer continue. After discussion, he decided to return. His name was Yuri Yudin. In interviews decades later, Yudin often recalled that moment. He said there was no sense of danger when they said goodbye. They even joked about celebrating together once the expedition ended. Yudin watched as his friends slowly disappeared into the snowy distance. It was the last time he would ever see them, because, by turning back that day, he unknowingly became the only survivor of the entire expedition. The remaining 9 hikers continued north. Their diaries documented the weather, their route, and the camps they built along the way. Photographs showed them smiling, joking, and posing in the snow. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that anything was wrong. But as they moved deeper into the remote Ural wilderness, they were approaching a lonely mountain pass that would later be known as Dyatlov Pass. At the time, it was just another unnamed location on a map. Within days, it would become the site of one of the most mysterious tragedies in modern history. And the footprints those hikers left behind in the snow would be the last traces of them ever found. By the 31st of January 1959, the hiking team had traveled deep into the remote wilderness of the Ural Mountains. For several days, they had been skiing through forests, frozen rivers, and valleys buried under thick snow. The weather was growing worse. Temperatures continued to drop as they moved farther north. Their goal was to reach one of the remote peaks of the region, Mount Oterton. But before reaching that mountain, they needed to cross another ridge. The Mansi people, the indigenous inhabitants of the region, had a name for this place: Kholat Syakh. The meaning of the name was ominous. It roughly translated to the Mountain of the Dead. At the time, however, the hikers did not see anything mysterious about it. For experienced winter adventurers, it was simply another part of the route. That day, the group initially planned to camp near the forest line. Camping near trees would provide protection from the wind and allow them to gather wood for a fire. But something went wrong. Based on diary entries later recovered from the site, the team encountered a powerful snowstorm while crossing the slope. Visibility quickly deteriorated. Strong winds blew snow directly into their faces. In those conditions, it is likely that they drifted off their intended route. By the time they realized the mistake, daylight was already fading. Continuing in darkness could lead to becoming completely lost. So the team leader, Igor Dyatlov, made a decision. They would set up camp directly on the exposed mountainside. At the time, it probably seemed like a practical solution. But many investigators later believed that this moment might have been the turning point of the entire tragedy. That evening, the hikers carved a platform into the snow on the slope. They secured their tent using skis and trekking poles. Photographs recovered later showed the group still in good spirits. Some members joked in front of the camera. Others threw snow at each other. None of them knew it would be the last time they were ever photographed. Night fell quickly. Winters in the Ural Mountains are brutally cold. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Wind roared across the open slope, shaking the tent violently. In such conditions, even a small mistake could become deadly. Investigators later estimated that by around 8 or 9 p.m., the hikers had likely entered their tent to rest. They removed their boots and heavy outer layers, placing them neatly along the inside wall of the tent. This was standard practice during winter expeditions. If equipment was blown away by the wind, survival would become almost impossible. Inside the tent, 9 people squeezed together in a small space. Their body heat slowly warmed the air. Perhaps they were talking. Perhaps they were planning the next day's route. According to their journals, the plan was to continue north the following morning and then descend toward the forest. Everything seemed normal. Nothing suggested danger. But sometime during that night, something happened. Something that forced 9 experienced hikers to make a decision that investigators would later struggle to explain. When rescuers eventually discovered the tent, they found that it had been cut open from the inside with a knife. And not just once. Several slashes were visible in the fabric. This meant that when the danger appeared, the hikers did not even use the tent entrance. Instead, they cut their way out and fled directly into the storm. Even more disturbing was what they left behind. Their boots were still inside the tent. Their heavy winter jackets remained there as well, in temperatures below -30 degrees. Leaving the tent without proper clothing would almost certainly mean death. Unless whatever they were escaping from was even more terrifying than the freezing night outside. Years later, the mountain pass where their tent stood was given a new name, in memory of their leader. It became known as Dyatlov Pass. But on the night of the 1st of February 1959, It was simply a lonely slope in the vast wilderness of the Ural Mountains, and a single tent stood there in the snow, shaken by the wind. Within hours, that quiet campsite would become the center of one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in modern history. After the night of the 1st of February 1959, no one ever saw the 9 hikers again. According to their original plan, the expedition was supposed to return to the city by the 12th of February. Once they reached the final settlement, they were expected to send a telegram confirming their safe arrival. This was standard procedure for hiking expeditions at the time. But on the 12th of February, no message arrived. At first, no one seemed overly worried. Winter expeditions were often delayed. Snowstorms, navigation errors, or unexpected detours could easily add several days to the journey. So teachers and students at the Ural Polytechnic Institute simply waited. One day passed. Then another. Still nothing. Gradually, concern began to spread. By the 16th of February, some family members started calling the institute to ask about the expedition. But the school had only one answer. They had received no news. More days passed. Finally, on the 20th of February, the expedition was officially 8 days overdue. The institute decided it was time to act. A search team composed of students and instructors was organized. Soon local authorities joined the effort. The military provided helicopters. Police officers and civilian volunteers joined the search. Across the vast and frozen wilderness of the northern Urals, a large rescue operation began. But the terrain was extremely harsh. Snow in some areas was several meters deep. Many locations were difficult to reach even on foot. Search teams had to move slowly, scanning the landscape for ski tracks, camp remains, or any sign of the hikers. Days later, one group discovered the first clue. A faint ski trail in the snow. The tracks led toward a slope. The rescuers followed them carefully. Then, on the 26th of February 1959, they saw something unusual on the mountainside. A strange shape partially buried in snow. It was a tent. Only the top portion was visible. Rescuers quickly began digging it out. When they finally opened the tent, everyone realized that something was terribly wrong. The tent was empty. All 9 hikers were gone. Inside, many of their belongings remained exactly where they had been left. Boots were lined up neatly. Heavy jackets hung inside the tent. Food, cameras, and journals were still there. It looked as if the hikers had simply stepped outside and never returned. Then investigators noticed an even more disturbing detail. One side of the tent had several long cuts in the fabric. The slashes had clearly been made from the inside. This meant the hikers had not used the entrance. They had cut their way out. Why would experienced hikers do something like that? In a blizzard, leaving the tent could mean certain death. Even stranger, many of them had left without proper clothing. Their boots were still inside. This suggested they had fled suddenly, without time to dress. There was only one explanation. Something had happened that forced them to escape within seconds. Outside the tent, rescuers began examining the snow. Soon they discovered a series of footprints. The tracks started near the tent and led slowly down the slope. They headed toward a dark forest in the distance. The footprints belonged to several different people. Some were made by feet wearing socks. Others appeared to be barefoot. But the strangest detail was this. The tracks did not look like they were running. They looked like they were walking calmly down the slope, as if the hikers were not fleeing in panic, but leaving under some kind of pressure. As the search team followed the trail toward the forest, they began to realize they were stepping into a mystery that would puzzle investigators for decades. And the most disturbing discoveries were still waiting ahead. standing beside the torn tent on the mountainside. The rescuers began to realize that this was no ordinary hiking accident. The tent stood alone on the slope, surrounded by rolling waves of wind-blown snow. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no massive snow collapse, just an eerie silence. A short distance below the tent, searchers noticed something unusual. A line of footprints in the snow. In the Ural Mountains, strong winds normally erased tracks within hours. But on that day, the weather had preserved part of the trail. The footprints began near the tent and continued down the slope. Their direction pointed toward the dark forest in the distance. Investigators soon confirmed that the tracks belonged to the 9 hikers. But there was something strange about them. The footprints were not chaotic. They did not overlap or scatter in different directions. Instead, they appeared to form a loose line, almost as if the hikers had left together, not in panic. Some prints clearly showed the outline of socks. Others appeared to be made by bare feet. A few belonged to someone wearing only a single boot. This meant that when the hikers left the tent, many of them had not even managed to put on proper clothing. In temperatures near -30 degrees Celsius, a person could survive only minutes under such conditions. Yet the tracks showed no signs of running or struggling. They moved slowly down the slope, each step spaced at a normal walking distance. It looked as if they were calmly walking downhill. This raised an even more confusing question. If they were truly terrified, why wasn't anyone running? Why didn't anyone attempt to return to the tent? Even more puzzling, there were no other tracks nearby. No second group of footprints. No animal tracks. Only the 9 hikers. The search team followed the trail down the slope. The wind grew stronger. The sky remained gray, and the snow reflected a dull white light. After about a kilometer, they finally reached the edge of the forest. The boundary between the open slope and the dark trees felt almost like a border between 2 worlds. Once inside the forest, the wind dropped significantly. This was exactly why hikers often preferred to camp near the tree line. The trees could block the mountain winds. Near the entrance of the forest, the rescuers found the first disturbing sign. A patch of snow had been disturbed. Nearby were pieces of burned wood. Someone had clearly attempted to start a fire. The trunk of a tree was blackened by smoke. Several branches had been broken. Some of them were snapped at a height of nearly 5 meters. This suggested that someone had climbed the tree, perhaps to look back toward the slope, perhaps to locate the tent in the darkness. Beneath that tree, the rescuers discovered 2 bodies. They were lying close together. Both were almost completely undressed. Only their underwear remained. Their bodies were frozen solid. Later forensic analysis suggested they likely died while trying to keep the fire alive. Their names were Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. Both men had severe injuries on their hands. Their skin was torn. Their fingernails were badly damaged. It appeared they had desperately clawed at the tree bark, perhaps trying to break branches to feed the fire. They had struggled to keep the flames alive. But in the brutal cold of the Ural winter, the fire eventually died. And yet, the mystery was far from over. As the search teams continued exploring the forest, they realized that the other hikers were not there. The footprints had led from the tent to the forest. But not all of them stopped at the fire, which meant that during that night, the 9 hikers may have separated. Some remained by the fire. Others went somewhere else. And the most unsettling question remained. What could have forced them to abandon their shelter, walk down the mountain, and disappear into the darkness of that forest? After the discovery of the 2 bodies near the fire, the mood among the search teams grew heavier. They now knew one thing for certain. The hikers had indeed left the tent that night, and at least 2 of them had died in the forest. But 7 people were still missing. Rescuers expanded the search area. They carefully examined every section of snow around the fire site. Soon, they noticed another set of tracks. Starting near the fire, a trail of footprints led back toward the slope. In other words, someone had attempted to return to the tent. This observation led investigators to an important theory. Perhaps after reaching the forest, some members of the group decided to risk going back to the tent. Inside the tent were their warm clothes and equipment. If they could retrieve their boots and jackets, they might survive the night. The search team followed the trail. After several hundred meters, they discovered the 3rd body. It was a young man lying face down in the snow. His body was pointed toward the mountain slope, as if he had been trying to reach the tent. His name was Igor Dyatlov, the leader of the expedition. His position told a clear story. One arm stretched forward, as though he had been reaching for something. Later forensic analysis suggested that he most likely died from hypothermia. There were no major external injuries, just a body that had been overwhelmed by the cold. However, investigators noticed something interesting. Dyatlov had slightly more clothing than the 2 men found by the fire. He was wearing a light jacket. This suggested that after leaving the tent, the hikers may have started sharing clothing among themselves. Some gave their garments to others. This behavior usually happens only in desperate situations, when someone in the group is already close to collapse. The search continued toward the slope. Soon they discovered the 4th body. She was Zinaida Kolmogorova. She was lying in the snow, her body also facing toward the tent. She was about 300 meters from Dyatlov. This suggested that she had been following the same route back. But she, too, never made it. Investigators noticed deep scratches on her hands, as if, in the final moments of her life, she had tried to crawl across the frozen ground. The wind continued to sweep across the mountainside. The searchers pressed on in silence. Soon, they discovered the 5th body. He was the oldest member of the expedition, and one of the most experienced hikers, Rustam Slobodin. His body also faced the direction of the tent, as if he too had been trying to return. But unlike the others, forensic experts later discovered a fracture in his skull. The injury was not severe enough to kill him by itself, yet it raised troubling questions. There were no signs of violence nearby, no rocks or hard objects that clearly explained the injury. With the discovery of these 3 bodies, a disturbing picture began to form. That night, at least 3 members of the expedition had tried to return to the tent. One by one, they collapsed in the snow, each one closer to the tent than the last. But none of them reached it. All of them died along the way, which meant that the remaining 4 hikers were likely still somewhere deeper in the forest. What the rescuers did not yet realize was that the most disturbing discovery of all would not be found until months later. After the 5th body was discovered, the search teams temporarily stopped moving further up the slope. The reason was simple. Based on the footprints and the locations of the bodies, investigators believed the 9 hikers had split into 2 groups that night. The first group stayed near the forest edge. They had tried to start a fire. 2 of them had already been found beside the remains of that fire. The second group appeared to have attempted to return to the tent. They walked back toward the slope, but one by one, they collapsed in the freezing cold. 5 members of the expedition had now been located, but 4 people were still missing. Investigators believed these 4 hikers might have gone deeper into the forest. Perhaps they tried to build a snow shelter. Perhaps they searched for a place protected from the wind. Search teams began combing the forest more carefully. But the forests of the Ural Mountains are vast. Heavy snow covered the ground. In some areas, the snow was several meters deep. If someone had fallen beneath it, their body could easily remain hidden. The search continued for weeks. Volunteers, soldiers, and police officers searched the frozen landscape meter by meter. But they could not find the missing hikers. As time passed, the weather slowly began to change. Temperatures rose slightly. The snow began to soften, and rescuers gradually faced a grim reality. If the 4 missing hikers were still alive, they would have emerged by now. By March 1959, officials had largely concluded that the remaining 4 were also dead, but their bodies were nowhere to be found. Time moved forward. Spring slowly arrived in the mountains. By late April, snow in parts of the Ural region began to melt. Ice layers cracked. Areas that had been buried under snow for months began to appear. It was during this time that a search team discovered something unusual deep in the forest. It was a ravine, a narrow depression in the terrain, 3 to 4 meters deep. Broken branches and thick snow filled the bottom. Searchers began probing the snow with long poles. Suddenly, one of the poles struck something solid. They began digging. Slowly, the snow was removed, and a disturbing sight emerged. First, a body, then another, then a third, and finally a fourth. The 4 missing hikers had finally been found. Their names were Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignuel, Simeon Zolotaryov. But when investigators examined the bodies, they quickly realized something disturbing. The injuries on these 4 hikers were very different from those found on the first 5. One had severe chest compression, another had a massive skull fracture, and one of the female hikers had suffered an even more unsettling condition. Her tongue was missing. These injuries did not resemble ordinary hypothermia deaths. They looked more like the result of extremely powerful force. Yet strangely, there were almost no visible external wounds. It was as if some invisible pressure had crushed the body from the inside. With the discovery of these final 4 bodies, the mystery of the expedition grew even darker, because what investigators were now facing no longer looked like a simple hiking accident. It looked like a series of deaths that defied easy explanation. When the final 4 bodies were transported back to the investigation center, the atmosphere among investigators became extremely tense, because what they saw went far beyond the scope of a typical mountaineering accident. Forensic teams began detailed examinations. The first alarming discovery involved severe internal injuries. One of the hikers, Nikolai Thibault-Brignuel, had suffered a massive fracture in his skull. According to the medical report, this type of injury usually occurs only in major car accidents or extremely violent impacts. Yet strangely, there were almost no visible wounds on the outside of his head. No torn skin. No heavy bleeding. It appeared as if an enormous force had passed through the surface of the body and struck the bone directly. Another body, Ludmila Dubinina, presented an even more shocking case. Several of her ribs were completely broken. Her chest cavity was severely crushed. Later forensic analysis suggested that the level of damage was comparable to being struck by a high-speed vehicle. Yet again, there were almost no major external wounds. It seemed as if the force involved was not sharp or cutting, but rather an overwhelming pressure. Even more disturbing, her tongue was missing. Part of the soft tissue inside her mouth had also disappeared. Investigators initially suspected animal activity. However, There were no clear bite marks nearby, and the other bodies showed no similar damage. This detail would later become one of the most widely discussed mysteries of the case. Meanwhile, another member of the expedition, Alexander Zolotaryov, also had severe chest fractures. His ribs were crushed, yet his face remained almost untouched. When rescuers discovered him, he was still wearing a camera around his neck, as if, in his final moments, he had been ready to document something. The fourth body, Simeon Zolotaryov, also displayed signs of strong blunt force trauma. These injuries led forensic experts to a puzzling conclusion. The victims had been exposed to extremely powerful forces, but the pattern of injuries did not resemble ordinary fighting or falling accidents. There were no signs of struggle nearby. No weapons. No footprints from other people. Not even signs of falling rocks. Even stranger, investigators discovered something unusual on some of the clothing. Certain garments contained traces of radioactive contamination. The levels were not extremely high, but finding radiation on ordinary hiking clothes was highly unusual. This discovery quickly caught the attention of investigators, because in the Soviet Union of 1959, radioactive materials were typically associated with military experiments or nuclear industry. Yet there were no official nuclear facilities recorded anywhere near the mountain region. At the same time, several local residents reported seeing strange glowing orange spheres in the sky during the nights around the time of the incident. The lights reportedly moved slowly across the sky. Sometimes they vanished suddenly. Sometimes they reappeared. These witness reports were never formally included in the final official conclusion. But over the decades, they became a major source of speculation. As more strange details emerged, investigators began to realize something unsettling. The Dyatlov Pass Incident did not appear to be a simple natural disaster. It had become a mystery, filled with unknown factors. In the spring of 1959, after all 9 hikers had been found, the Soviet authorities launched a full investigation. The case was led by Lev Ivanov, a regional prosecutor. His mission was simple in theory: determine how the 9 hikers had died. Investigators collected a large amount of evidence. This included the location of the tent, the hiking route, forensic reports, and photographs taken by search teams. All of these details were compiled into official files. However, the deeper investigators looked, the more confusing the case became. First, the tent had been cut open from the inside. This indicated that the hikers themselves had left it. Second, they left the tent with almost no clothing, in temperatures approaching -30 degrees Celsius. Such a decision would normally mean certain death. Third, there were no signs of outsiders at the scene. No additional footprints. No evidence of struggle. Fourth, several bodies showed massive internal injuries, while the skin and external tissues remained largely intact. Even forensic experts struggled to explain this. The investigation lasted several months. During that time, various theories began to circulate. Some believed it was an avalanche. Others suspected a military experiment. Some speculated that the hikers had been attacked by local tribes. However, almost every theory failed to explain all the evidence. For example, if it had been an avalanche, why was the tent still largely intact? If it had been an attack, why were there no other footprints? If there had been a violent struggle, why were there no weapons nearby? Facing these contradictions, the investigation eventually reached a dead end. In May 1959, the Soviet authorities released the official conclusion. The report stated that the hikers had died due to an overwhelming natural force which they were unable to overcome. The wording was extremely vague. It did not specify what the force was, nor did it explain the unusual injuries. Soon afterward, the case was officially closed. Many of the investigation files were sealed. At the time, documents involving unusual incidents in the Soviet Union were often classified. For decades, very little additional information became public. The Dyatlov Pass Incident slowly turned into a legend. Then, in 1990, the original investigator, Lev Ivanov, gave an interview. During that interview, he admitted that he himself had never fully understood certain aspects of the case. He even acknowledged that investigators had received multiple reports about mysterious glowing spheres in the sky. However, those reports were never included in the final official statement. His comments reignited public curiosity about the case, because it suggested that the original investigation might not have revealed everything. In the decades that followed, Dyatlov Pass slowly transformed from a tragic accident into one of the most famous mysteries in the world. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many old archives began to open. Researchers, journalists, and documentary filmmakers started re-examining the case. As a result, numerous theories began to emerge. One of the most widely discussed explanations was the avalanche theory. According to this idea, a small snowslide may have occurred on the mountain slope that night. Even if it was not a massive avalanche, it might have been enough to threaten the tent. Fearing they could be buried, the hikers may have cut their way out and fled into the night. However, this explanation still leaves many questions. First, the tent was not crushed by snow. Second, there were no clear avalanche debris patterns at the site. Because of these issues, many researchers believe an avalanche alone cannot explain the incident. Another theory involves military testing. During the 1950s, the Soviet Union conducted many experimental weapons programs. These included parachute mines and other types of explosive devices. Some investigators suggest that the hikers may have accidentally entered a testing area. If a weapon detonated nearby, a powerful shockwave could have caused severe internal injuries. This might explain why some victims had crushed ribs without obvious external wounds. However, there is no direct evidence supporting this theory. The Soviet government never confirmed any military experiments in the region. A third theory is far more mysterious. Some people have connected the case to unidentified flying objects. Several witnesses at the time reported seeing strange glowing orange spheres moving across the sky. These reports came from local residents and even some military personnel. According to this theory, the hikers may have witnessed something unusual in the sky, perhaps even encountering an unknown force. Of course, no scientific evidence has ever supported this idea. There are also more extreme speculations. Some claim the hikers encountered an unknown creature. Others believe they were attacked by a legendary snowman, said to roam the mountains. Most of these ideas come from folklore, rather than credible evidence. Still, they have helped keep the mystery alive. Among all the theories, one explanation has gained increasing attention from scientists. It is known as the infrasound panic effect. According to this theory, strong winds interacting with certain mountain formations can create extremely low-frequency sound waves. Humans cannot easily hear these frequencies, but they may affect the nervous system. In some cases, they may trigger sudden anxiety or panic. If the hikers experienced such an effect, they might have suddenly felt overwhelming fear and rushed out of the tent. While this theory sounds plausible, it still fails to explain the severe bone fractures found on several victims. And so, even after more than 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass Incident remains without a universally accepted explanation. In 2019, the Russian government decided to reopen the long-closed investigation. The new inquiry was led by the Russian Prosecutor General's office. Their goal was simple: to reanalyze the evidence using modern scientific methods. Investigators reviewed the original archives. They also used computer simulations to recreate the weather conditions, mountain slope, and snow stability from that night. Eventually, the team presented a new explanation. According to their conclusion, a rare type of slab avalanche likely occurred on the slope. Unlike a massive avalanche, this type of event involves a dense plate of snow suddenly sliding downhill. The snow slab may have begun pressing toward the tent during the night. When the hikers felt the pressure, they feared the entire snow layer might collapse. In response, they quickly cut their way out of the tent and retreated downhill. This theory explains why the tent was cut from the inside and why the hikers fled without proper clothing. After reaching the forest, their situation grew worse. 2 of them attempted to start a fire. 3 tried to return to the tent, but the extreme cold slowly drained their body heat. As for the 4 hikers later found in the ravine, investigators believe they may have fallen into the deep gully in the darkness. Heavy snow collapsing over them could have caused the severe chest and head injuries. At first glance, this explanation appears to resolve many of the mysteries. Yet several questions remain. For example, why were there so few obvious avalanche traces near the tent? Why did some injuries resemble extremely powerful impacts? And what about the glowing orange spheres that witnesses reported seeing in the sky? Even today, Dyatlov Pass continues to attract researchers and explorers. Every year, people travel to the remote mountain pass, trying to retrace the route of the hikers. They hope that one day, new evidence might finally explain what happened. But perhaps the truth of that night is known only to the 9 hikers themselves. Their names are still remembered: Igor Dyatlov, Zenita Kolmogorova, Rustam Slobodin, Yuri Krivonishenko, Yuri Doroshenko, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignolle, Simeon Zolotaryov. And the mountain pass where they perished has become one of the most haunting locations in the history of unsolved mysteries. Because on that frozen slope, what remains is not a clear answer, but a question that has lasted for more than 60 years. What really happened that night? More than 60 years have passed. Scientists, journalists, and explorers have all tried to solve this mystery. Some believe it was an avalanche. Others suspect a secret military experiment. And some think the hikers may have witnessed something unknown in the sky. But even today, no single theory explains all the evidence. Why did they cut open their own tent? Why did they leave their equipment behind in deadly freezing temperatures? Why did some die from hypothermia, while others suffered massive fractures? And what were the strange glowing lights reported in the night sky? Perhaps the answers were buried long ago, beneath layers of snow and time. Perhaps that night, the hikers encountered something they simply could not understand. Even today, adventurers continue to travel to Dyatlov Pass. They follow the same route, camp on the same frozen slopes. But no one has ever been able to fully reconstruct what happened on that night. In February 1959, maybe the 9 hikers took the truth with them into the coldest mystery this world has ever known.